The breadstick hit the plate with a dry crack, spinning once before settling in front of Jordan like an insult wrapped in carbs. My stepfather leaned back in his chair, swirling his bourbon, that smug half-smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Growing boys don't need fancy food," Bob said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Fills the stomach just the same." Across from us, Brian's twin daughters giggled over their shrimp cocktails, sauce dripping down their chins while my mother adjusted her pearls and studied the wine list like it contained the secrets of the universe. Jordan's hand hovered over his fork, 14 years old and already learning to swallow humiliation with his water. And in that moment, watching my son's shoulders curl inward, watching my mother pretend she hadn't heard, watching Bob's satisfied smirk as he cut into his $50 steak, I felt the last thread of obligation snap clean through. My name is Amanda Pierce. And that breadstick was the final straw in a lifetime of being treated like the help at my own family's table. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Texas heat had started to soften by the time Jordan and I pulled into the parking lot of the Riverside Grill. Late May in Austin meant the sun hung lower, painting everything gold and orange, the kind of light that made the city look like it was trying to apologize for the 100-degree afternoons. Jordan sat in the passenger seat, picking at a loose thread on his jeans, his camera bag tucked between his feet. He'd been quiet the whole drive from our apartment in South Austin, the kind of quiet that meant he was thinking too hard about something he didn't want to say out loud. "Mom, do you think Grandma actually wants us there?" The question landed heavier than it should have. I glanced over at him, his dark hair falling across his forehead, his jaw starting to square out in that way that reminded me he wouldn't be my little boy much longer. "Of course she does," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's her 60th birthday. She specifically asked for both of us to be there." Jordan nodded but didn't look convinced. He had a photographer's eye for details most people missed, and over the years, he'd noticed plenty about how my family operated. How my mother's hugs always lasted a half-second too short. How Bob never asked him about school or his photography or anything that mattered. How Brian's kids got presents at Christmas while Jordan got gift cards to places we couldn't afford to shop anyway. I'd spent 3 weeks planning tonight. I called the restaurant myself, reserved a spot in their private dining area overlooking Lady Bird Lake, the one with the string lights and the view of the Congress Avenue Bridge where the bats came out at dusk. I even ordered a custom cake from that bakery on South Lamar, the expensive one with Mom's favorite lemon lavender flavor and delicate sugar flowers that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. I told myself this dinner could be different, that maybe, just maybe, if I showed up with enough effort and grace and the right amount of enthusiasm, my mother would finally see me as more than the daughter who didn't quite measure up. The one who'd had a baby too young, who'd divorced too quickly, who chose art over stability and rented instead of owned and drove a 10-year-old sedan that made weird noises when it rained. I wanted her to see me. Really see me. Just once. The restaurant hummed with the low buzz of conversation and clinking silverware as we walked through the main dining room. A hostess in all black led us toward the back, past tables full of couples celebrating anniversaries and groups of friends laughing over shared plates. The private room sat behind glass doors, already glowing warm with candlelight. And there they were. Bob at the head of the table, naturally, his broad shoulders filling out a polo shirt that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, his tan deep and even, the look of a man who spent his weekends on a boat he'd bought with other people's insurance premiums. Next to him sat Brian, my stepbrother, 32 years old and still living off his father's generosity like it was a permanent career plan. He had Bob's build but none of the discipline, his gut pressing against a button-down shirt, a beer already sweating in front of him even though we were supposed to be toasting with champagne. His twin daughters, Kaylee and Kennedy, 9 years old and dressed in matching sundresses, were absorbed in their phones, thumbs flying across screens. My mother sat to Bob's right, her silver hair styled in soft waves, her navy dress elegant and understated in that way that only money can buy. She looked up when we entered, her smile brief and polite, the kind you'd give a distant acquaintance. "Oh good, you made it," she said, not rising from her seat. We were starting to wonder. "We're 10 minutes early," I said, keeping my voice light. "I wanted to make sure everything was perfect for your big day." Bob glanced at his watch, a thick gold thing that caught the light. Traffic must have been good, he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, just a vague implication that we usually ran late. We don't, for the record. I'm always early. But in Bob's world, facts bent around his preferences. Jordan and I took our seats at the far end of the table, the spot farthest from Bob and my mother, closest to the window. Brian barely acknowledged us, but Kaylee looked up long enough to wrinkle her nose. Why doesn't Jordan ever talk? Because he's smart enough to know when he's not wanted, I thought, but I smiled instead. He's just a little shy around new people. We've known him for like 6 years, Kennedy said flatly. Exactly, Jordan muttered under his breath, and I squeezed his hand under the table. The waiter appeared with menus, explaining the specials with the kind of rehearsed enthusiasm that meant he'd said these words 100 times today. Bob ordered a ribeye medium rare. Brian asked for the surf and turf. My mother chose the Chilean sea base. The twins wanted chicken tenders, but Bob upgraded them to crab cakes because why not, they're celebrating. When the waiter turned to me, I ordered the grilled salmon, something mid-range, conscious of the fact that even though I'd reserved the room, I knew Bob would make a show of paying the bill and holding it over me later. And for the young man, the waiter asked, smiling at Jordan. Jordan glanced at the menu, his eyes landing on the burger. A safe choice, something he knew he'd actually eat. I'll have the burger medium with fries. Before the waiter could write it down, Bob cut in. Just bring him some bread, he said casually, as if he were doing us a favor. Growing boys don't need all that rich food. Keeps them sharp. The waiter hesitated, glancing between Bob and me. I opened my mouth to correct him, but my mother touched Bob's arm lightly, laughing in that airy way she had. Oh Bob, don't be silly. Let the boy order what he wants. But her hand stayed on his arm, a gentle restraint that somehow also felt like agreement. Bob shrugged, magnanimous. Fine, fine. But don't come crying to me when he's got a stomachache later. Rich food never agrees with kids his age. Jordan stared down at his menu, his jaw tight. I could see the flush creeping up his neck, the embarrassment settling into his bones. It's fine, Mom, he said quietly. I'm not that hungry anyway. Just the bread is okay. No, I said firmly. He'll have the burger. The waiter nodded quickly and retreated before Bob could argue. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table, broken only by Brian laughing at something on his phone. Bob took a long sip of his bourbon, letting the ice clink against the glass. You always were stubborn, Amanda, he said, not quite looking at me. Wonder where the kid gets it. From his mother, my mother said lightly, as if that explained everything. As if my so-called stubborn insistence that my child be fed an actual meal was some character flaw I'd inherited from my father, the man she'd divorced 20 years ago and still spoke about like he was a cautionary tale. The appetizers arrived in waves. Calamari for Bob. Bacon-wrapped scallops for Brian. Bruschetta for my mother. Shrimp cocktail for the twins, who squealed and fought over who got the biggest shrimp. And then, with a strange kind of ceremony, the waiter placed a bread basket in the center of the table. Plain breadsticks. Dry. Unbuttered. The kind of thing you'd get for free at a chain restaurant. Bob nudged it toward Jordan with 2 fingers. There you go, champ, he said. That'll hold you over. Brian snorted into his beer. The twins giggled. My mother folded her napkin across her lap, her eyes on her phone. Jordan reached for a breadstick, his hand trembling just slightly, and I saw it then. The exact moment my son decided he wasn't worth a real appetizer. That he should be grateful for scraps. That this was just how things were in families like ours. And something inside me didn't just crack. It shattered. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. The whole table went quiet. Excuse me, I said, my voice steady and cold. I need to speak with our waiter. I walked out of the private room, my heels clicking sharp against the tile, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack a rib. The waiter was near the bar, entering orders into the computer. Excuse me, I said. He turned, concerned. Is everything all right? No, I said. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Said. It's not. I need you to cancel any appetizers that haven't come out yet. And I need you to bring my son the largest appetizer sampler you have. Immediately. He blinked. Of course. Anything else? Yes, I said, my voice dropping lower. When the check comes, split it. Everything my son and I ordered goes on my card. Everything else goes on Mr. Caldwell's. His eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. Understood. I walked back into that room and sat down, meeting Bob's gaze head-on. Jordan's burger is on its way, I said calmly, along with an appetizer sampler. For him. Bob's face darkened. Amanda, that's completely unnecessary. So was the breadstick, I said. But here we are. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. Brian stared at me like I just set the table on fire. The twins looked confused, glancing between their grandfather and me like they were watching a tennis match. And Jordan, my beautiful, kind, too patient son, looked at me with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. The rest of the dinner crawled by in excruciating silence. When Jordan's loaded appetizer platter arrived, piled high with wings, sliders, mozzarella sticks, and jalapeno poppers, Bob's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. My mother picked at her sea base, her face carefully blank. Brian muttered something under his breath about spoiled kids, which was rich coming from a 32-year-old man whose father still paid his car insurance. I barely touched my salmon. I was too busy watching Jordan eat, watching him smile for the first time all night, watching him realize he didn't have to shrink himself to fit into spaces that were never meant for him. When the check came, the waiter placed 2 leather portfolios on the table. One in front of me, one in front of Bob. Bob opened his, and I watched the color drain from his face. What the hell is this? He said, his voice low and dangerous. That's your portion, I said. I'm covering mine and Jordan's. You don't get to humiliate my son, and then pretend you're doing us a favor by paying for dinner. Bob's hand slammed the table, rattling the glasses. This is completely out of line. No, I said, standing again, gathering my purse. What's out of line is treating a child like he's less than. What's out of line is making my son feel unwelcome at his own grandmother's birthday. What's out of line is you. I pulled a small gift box from my bag and set it in front of my mother. Happy birthday, Mom. I had your favorite cake delivered. It's in the car. I hope you enjoy it. Then I held out my hand to Jordan. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home. We walked out of the Riverside Grill into the warm Texas night, the sound of the lake lapping against the shore, the city lights glittering across the water. Jordan looked up at me, his eyes bright. That was awesome, Mom. I squeezed his hand. You're worth so much more than breadsticks, kiddo. Always have been. Always will be. And as we drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of my mother's birthday dinner, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what they thought of me. I was afraid I'd wasted so much time caring. The drive home from the Riverside Grill should have felt like a victory lap. Jordan sat beside me, still riding the high of standing up to Bob's casual cruelty, his fingers drumming against his camera bag in that restless way he had when his mind was working through something. But as the Austin skyline faded in the rearview mirror and we merged onto Mopac heading south, the adrenaline that had carried me through dinner started to curdle into something else. Dread, maybe. Or the hollow awareness that I'd just detonated a bomb in the middle of my family and would soon be dealing with the fallout. My phone sat in the cup holder between us, screen dark and silent. Too silent. In my family, silence never meant peace. It meant someone was reloading. We pulled into our apartment complex just as the sun finished setting, the sky bruised purple and orange over the South Austin neighborhoods. Our building was one of those older stucco places with exterior staircases and a courtyard pool that hadn't been cleaned since March. Not fancy, but it was ours. 2 bedrooms, rent I could mostly afford, and a landlord who didn't ask questions when the check was a few days late. Jordan grabbed his camera bag and headed for the stairs while I locked the car, my heels clicking against the pavement. Inside, the apartment smelled like the vanilla candle I'd lit that morning, trying to cover the faint mustiness that came with living in a ground-floor unit in Texas humidity. Jordan dropped his bag by the couch and headed straight for the kitchen, pulling open the fridge. I'm still hungry, he said, which made me laugh despite everything. You just ate your weight in appetizers. He grinned, that crooked smile that reminded me so much of his father, back when his father still smiled at me. Yeah, but that was spite food. Spite food doesn't count. I kicked off my heels and collapsed onto the couch, my phone still clutched in my hand. The screen lit up almost immediately, like it had been waiting for me to look. 7 missed calls. 14 text messages. 3 voicemails. All from the same 3 people. I opened the texts first, starting with Brian because his were always the most predictable. The first one came through 20 minutes after we left the restaurant. Real classy, sis. Way to ruin Mom's birthday. The second, 10 minutes later. Dad's pissed. Hope you're happy. The third, just 5 minutes ago. You always were a selfish bitch. Couldn't just let people enjoy one night. I stared at that last message, the words blurring slightly. Brian, who had never paid for his own phone bill. Brian, who still borrowed money from Bob for car payments. Brian, who had exactly one job in his entire adult life and got fired for showing up drunk. Brian, who somehow always had an opinion about my choices despite making exclusively terrible ones himself. I didn't respond. Responding to Brian was like arguing with a mud puddle. Pointless, and you just ended up dirty. My mother's texts were more surgical. Amanda, we need to talk about tonight. That was it. That was the whole message. No acknowledgement of what Bob had done. No concern for Jordan. Just a vague assertion that I'd done something wrong and needed to be corrected. The follow-up came an hour later. You embarrassed your stepfather in front of the entire family. This isn't like you. Except it was exactly like me. The me I'd buried under years of trying to be good enough, compliant enough, quiet enough to earn love that was never going to come. I scrolled past her messages to Bob's, and those made my stomach twist. The first was a single sentence. You owe me an apology. The second was longer. I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but that stunt you pulled tonight was completely unacceptable. Your mother is devastated. We've always treated Jordan like family, and this is how you repay us? I read that line again. We've always treated Jordan like family. As if family meant breadsticks while everyone else ate shrimp. As if family meant being seated at the far end of the table like an afterthought. As if family meant my son learning to expect less, want less, be less just to avoid making Bob uncomfortable. Jordan appeared in the doorway holding a sandwich, watching me with those 2 observant eyes. They texting you? I nodded. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. You gonna answer? Not tonight, I said. Tonight we just breathe. He sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and we stayed like that for a while, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of someone's television through the walls. Eventually Jordan went to his room, and I heard the soft click of his door closing, the familiar sounds of him setting up his laptop and uploading photos from tonight. He documented everything, my son. Every moment, every angle, every shadow. Sometimes I wondered what he saw through that lens that the rest of us missed. I should have gone to bed. Should have turned off my phone and dealt with everything in the morning when I had the energy to be diplomatic. Instead, I opened my laptop and did something I'd been avoiding for months. I Googled Bob Caldwell. Not because I expected to find anything shocking. Bob was careful. Bob was respectable. Bob had spent 30 years building a reputation as a successful insurance broker, a pillar of the Westlake community, a man who coached Little League and sponsored charity golf tournaments and never missed church on Sunday. But reputations, I'd learned, were just stories people told loudly enough that everyone stopped asking questions. The first page of results was exactly what I expected. His business website. A few mentions in local news about fundraisers. His LinkedIn profile with a photo of him shaking hands with the mayor. But on the second page, buried under the carefully curated public image, I found something else. A lawsuit. Settled out of court 3 years ago. The details were sealed, but the case number was public. Caldwell versus Hendricks. I clicked through to the county records, my pulse picking up. Catherine Hendricks had worked for Bob's insurance company for 6 years before filing a complaint for workplace discrimination and wrongful termination. The case had been dismissed with a settlement agreement and a non-disclosure clause. No details. No explanation. Just money changing hands and silence purchased. I sat back staring at the screen. One lawsuit could mean anything. A disgruntled employee. A misunderstanding. But it also meant Bob had enemies. People who'd seen behind the curtain and hadn't liked what they found. I was about to close the laptop when another link caught my eye. A local news article from 8 years ago, just after Bob and my mother got married. Prominent Austin businessman expands insurance empire. The photo showed Bob standing in front of his new office building in Westlake, my mother beside him in a pale pink suit, both of them smiling for the camera. But it was the caption that made me stop. Robert Caldwell celebrates the opening of his expanded firm with wife Linda and son Brian. The business, founded 20 years ago with a modest investment, has grown into one of Austin's most successful independent insurance brokers. A modest investment. I'd heard Bob tell the story a dozen times at family dinners. How he'd started with nothing. How he'd built everything from scratch through hard work and determination. How success was just a matter of discipline and vision. But modest investments came from somewhere. And 23 years ago, my mother had still been married to my father. 23 years ago, my grandparents had still been alive. 23 years ago, my family had owned Pierce Printing, a small but profitable business in East Austin that had been in our family for 2 generations. I opened a new tab and searched for Pierce Printing. The business had closed 15 years ago, sold off in pieces after my grandfather died and my grandmother got too sick to manage it. I'd been in my early 20s then, pregnant with Jordan and barely holding my own life together. I hadn't paid attention to the details. Hadn't asked questions about where the money went or why my mother seemed so eager to liquidate everything and move on. Now, sitting in my dark apartment with only the glow of the laptop screen, those questions started multiplying. My phone buzzed again. Another text from my mother. Amanda, please call me. We need to resolve this. I turned the phone face down and kept digging. By 2 in the morning, I'd found pieces of a story that didn't quite fit together, but implied a shape I didn't like. My grandfather's will, filed with the county probate court. My grandmother's amended trust documents. A property transfer dated 6 months before my mother's wedding to Bob. Business dissolution papers for Pierce Printing, signed by my mother as executor of the estate. And woven through all of it Bob's name. Not prominently. Not obviously. But there, like a watermark you only saw when you held the paper up to the light. I needed the actual documents. The ones that would have been filed with the family lawyer. The ones my mother had probably boxed up and stored away, thinking no one would ever care enough to look. I knew exactly where they'd be. My mother was nothing if not organized. After my grandmother died, she'd rented a storage unit to hold all the family papers, photos, and furniture she couldn't fit in the house Bob had bought in Westlake. She'd given me a key years ago, back when she still pretended to value my input on family decisions. I'd never used it. Never had a reason to. Until now. Jordan's door opened and he shuffled out, rubbing his eyes. Mom, it's like 2 in the morning. I know, sweetheart. Go back to bed. He squinted at my laptop screen. What are you doing? Research, I said. He nodded slowly, too smart to believe that was the whole truth but too tired to push. You okay? I looked at my son, 14 years old and already learning to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Yeah, I said. Think I am. He went back to his room and I closed the laptop, my mind already racing ahead to tomorrow. To the storage unit in North Austin with the roll-up door and the combination lock. To the boxes of documents my mother had packed away, thinking the past was something you could seal up and forget. But the past, I was learning, had a way of demanding attention. The past sent you breadsticks at family dinners. The past showed up in sealed lawsuits and property transfers. The past whispered that maybe the story you've been told your whole life wasn't the true one. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to find out what really happened to my family's business, my inheritance, and the modest investment that built Bob Caldwell's empire. I finally went to bed around 3, my mind still spinning through possibilities and implications. Sleep came in restless waves, punctuated by dreams of breadsticks turning into legal documents and my mother's voice saying we need to talk over and over like a broken record. When I woke up, the morning light was already harsh through the blinds, the Texas sun announcing itself with its usual lack of subtlety. My phone showed 9:30, which meant I'd overslept, which meant Jordan had probably already made himself breakfast and was currently doing whatever 14-year-olds do on Saturday mornings when their mothers are having existential crises. I found him in the living room, laptop open, surrounded by printed photos spread across the coffee table. He looked up when I appeared, still in my pajamas, my hair probably defying several laws of physics. Morning, he said. I made coffee. You're my favorite child, I said. I'm your only child. Still my favorite. I poured myself a cup and joined him on the couch, looking at the photos he'd arranged in careful rows. They were all from last night. The restaurant. The table. My mother adjusting her pearls. Bob cutting his steak. Brian on his phone, the twins with their shrimp cocktails, and there, in the center of the arrangement, the bread basket. Jordan had captured it from multiple angles, the dry breadsticks looking even more pathetic in high resolution. In one shot, you could see Bob's hand pushing it toward Jordan's plate. In another, you could see Jordan's expression, that careful blankness that kids learn when they're trying not to cry. "Why are you printing these?" I asked carefully. Jordan shrugged, but his jaw was tight. "I document stuff. That's what I do. It helps me process." I looked at the photos again, seeing them through his eyes. This wasn't just a kid playing with his camera. This was evidence. A visual record of exactly what had happened, preserved in painful detail. "You're a brilliant photographer," I said. "And you're going to make someone very uncomfortable someday with how clearly you see things." "Good," Jordan said. He gathered the photos into a neat stack and slipped them into a folder. "I'm going to Matt's house later. We're working on a project for photography club." I nodded, grateful he had somewhere to be. Someone to hang out with who wasn't currently navigating family warfare. "Sounds good. Be home by 6? He agreed and disappeared into his room to get ready. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when my phone rang. Not a text this time. An actual call. My mother's name lit up the screen and I stared at it, watching it ring once, twice, 3 times. I could let it go to voicemail. Could pretend I was busy or hadn't heard it or was still too angry to talk. But avoiding her would only delay the inevitable, and I'd learned long ago that my mother's patience was really just another form of control. She would keep calling until I answered, and each ignored call would be added to the list of ways I disappointed her. I answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, Mom." "Amanda, thank God." Her voice was strained, carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound hurt rather than angry. "I've been trying to reach you since last night." "I know," I said. "I needed some space." "Space," she repeated like it was a foreign concept. "Amanda, what you did last night was inexcusable. You humiliated Bob in front of the entire family. You made a scene at my birthday dinner. You upset the girls. And you left without even giving me my cake." I took a breath, counting to 5 the way my therapist had taught me back when I could afford therapy. "Mom, Bob gave Jordan a breadstick while everyone else had appetizers. He treated my son like he wasn't worth feeding. That's inexcusable." "Oh, Amanda, that's not what happened at all. You're being so dramatic. Bob was just trying to be helpful. He knows teenage boys have sensitive stomachs and he didn't want Jordan to feel sick. By giving him dry bread? By singling him out in front of everyone? By making it clear he's less important than Brian's kids? You're twisting everything," she said, her voice tightening. "Bob has always been nothing but generous with you and Jordan. He let you move back to Austin when you had nowhere else to go. He's helped with Jordan's school expenses. He's tried to be a father figure even though you make it impossible." I repeated. "He let me move back to my hometown. How generous. And those school expenses, you mean the $200 he gave me 3 years ago that he's mentioned at every family gathering since? That generous contribution he holds over my head like I owe him my firstborn?" "Amanda Louise Pierce," my mother said, pulling out the full name like a weapon. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but this attitude needs to stop. You've always been ungrateful, but this is beyond acceptable." There it was. The real issue. Not that Bob had been cruel to Jordan. Not that I'd been hurt or angry or finally stood up for myself. The problem was that I'd been ungrateful. That I hadn't performed the appropriate level of thankfulness for scraps. "I'm not doing this," I said quietly. "What?" "I'm not doing this anymore, Mom. I'm not pretending that the way Bob treats Jordan is okay. I'm not pretending that I'm the problem when I'm the one who shows up and helps and pays for things and gets treated like an inconvenience. I'm done." "You don't mean that." "I do," I said. "And until you're ready to acknowledge that what happened last night was wrong, I don't think we should talk." "Amanda, if you hang up this phone," my mother said, her voice dropping to that dangerous quiet, "you're going to regret it." "Maybe," I said. "But right now I regret a lot of things, and protecting Bob's feelings isn't going to be one of them anymore." I ended the call before she could respond and immediately turned off my phone. My hands were shaking, my heart hammering against my ribs. I'd never hung up on my mother before. Never cut her off mid-sentence. Never refused to engage with her particular brand of guilt and manipulation. Jordan emerged from his room, backpack slung over one shoulder, and stopped when he saw my face. "You okay?" I nodded, not quite trusting my voice. He crossed the room and hugged me, quick and tight, the way teenage boys hug when they're worried but don't want to make it weird. "You did good, Mom," he said. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, and I was alone with the silence and the trembling and the dawning realization that I just walked away from my mother. Maybe forever. The storage unit was on the north side of Austin, tucked behind a Home Depot in one of those sprawling facilities with hundreds of identical orange doors and numbers that never seemed to be in logical order. I'd only been here once before, years ago when my mother first rented it, and I'd spent an hour driving in circles looking for Unit 217 before finally asking someone for help. Today I found it on the first try, muscle memory guiding me past the rows of locked doors to the one that held my family's history. The combination lock stuck a little, the mechanism gritty with dust and heat, but it opened on the third try. I rolled up the door and was immediately hit with the smell of cardboard and mothballs and something else, something older. The smell of things that used to matter. The unit was about 10 by 15, packed floor to ceiling with boxes, furniture draped in sheets, and stacks of framed photos leaning against the walls. My mother's organizational system was evident even here. Everything labeled in her neat handwriting. Holiday decorations, kitchen items, grandma's quilts, tax records 1995 through 2000. I pulled out my phone, using the flashlight to read labels in the dim space. The afternoon sun cut harsh angles through the open door behind me, but most of the unit stayed in shadow. I found what I was looking for in the back corner. 5 boxes labeled estate documents and family business records. They were heavy, packed tight, and covered in a layer of dust that suggested no one had touched them in years. I dragged the first box into the light and sat down on the concrete floor, not caring about the dust or the heat or the fact that I was technically trespassing through my family's secrets without permission. The first box held mostly tax returns and bank statements from Pierce Printing, dating back to the early 90s. I flipped through them quickly, looking for patterns. The business had been profitable. Not wildly successful but steady. My grandfather had run it conservatively, more interested in sustainability than growth. He'd employed 6 people, printed everything from wedding invitations to business cards to local restaurant menus. Nothing fancy but honest work that paid the bills and put food on the table. The second box was more interesting. Legal documents, contracts, incorporation papers. And there, near the bottom, a manila folder marked Business Sale 1998. My heart rate picked up as I opened it. Inside were the documents from when my grandfather had brought on a partner, someone to help manage the business while he dealt with my grandmother's declining health. The partner's name was listed on every page. Robert James Caldwell. I stared at the name, trying to reconcile what I was reading with what I'd been told. Bob hadn't just invested in his own company. He'd invested in ours. Had become a partner in Pierce Printing 3 years before he married my mother. 3 years before my grandfather died, and the business mysteriously needed to be sold. I dug deeper, pulling out more folders, more documents. A partnership agreement giving Bob 30% of the company in exchange for a capital investment of $50,000. Loan documents showing Pierce Printing borrowing money from Caldwell Insurance Services at an interest rate that made my stomach turn. Promissory notes. Default notices. And finally, buried at the very bottom of the box, a sales agreement dated 6 months after my grandfather's death. Pierce Printing sold to Caldwell Holdings LLC for $150,000, roughly half of what it should have been worth according to the most recent valuation I'd found in the earlier documents. My mother's signature was on every page, neat and careful, right next to Bob's. The sunlight had shifted, throwing the storage unit into deeper shadow. I sat there surrounded by papers, trying to piece together a timeline. Bob meets my mother, probably through some business connection. Bob invests in Pierce Printing, becoming a partner. My grandfather gets sick, can't manage things as carefully. Bob's company starts loaning money to Pierce Printing at predatory rates. My grandfather dies. My grandmother is too ill to understand what's happening. My mother, who's never been good with business, signs whatever Bob puts in front of her. Pierce Printing gets sold to Bob's holding company for a fraction of its value. Bob and my mother get married 6 months later. Bob uses the assets from Pierce Printing to expand his insurance empire. And somewhere in all of that, my inheritance disappeared. I pulled out the third box, looking for my grandfather's will. It took 20 minutes of digging, but I found it. A simple document, clearly written, leaving everything to my grandmother with the stipulation that upon her death, the estate would be divided equally between my mother and me. Equal shares. That's what it said, in black and white, notarized and witnessed. But I'd never seen a penny. Never been told there was anything to inherit. Had simply assumed that medical bills and end-of-life care had eaten through whatever remained. I photographed every document, every page, every signature. My phone storage filled up and I had to delete apps to make room for more photos. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was fraud. This was theft. This was Bob systematically dismantling my family's business and my inheritance while romancing my grieving mother. The fourth box held more recent documents. My grandmother's trust, amended multiple times in the years before her death. Each amendment gave my mother more control, more authority to make decisions. And each amendment was dated within months of major financial decisions that benefited Bob. Property transfers, asset sales, account closures. By the time my grandmother died, there was nothing left to inherit because it had all been transferred, sold, or absorbed into Bob's growing empire. All legal, all documented, all signed by my mother, who either didn't understand what she was approving or didn't care. I sat back against a box labeled Christmas dishes and laughed, the sound bitter and wrong in the dusty silence. My mother had spent my entire adult life making me feel like I was the one who couldn't get her life together. Like I was the failure who'd had a baby too young, and chosen the wrong career and couldn't afford a house in the right neighborhood. Meanwhile, she'd handed my inheritance to the man who'd systematically stripped our family business for parts. The last box held photos and I almost didn't open it. Almost figured I had enough, that I didn't need to torture myself with images of happier times. But something made me pull back the flaps and look inside. They were older photos from before Bob. My parents' wedding. My childhood birthdays. Family vacations to South Padre Island. My father, young and smiling, his arm around my mother who actually looked happy instead of carefully composed. And at the bottom, a photo I'd never seen before. My grandfather in front of Pierce Printing, probably in the late 80s based on the fashion and the cars in the background. He stood proud beside the sign bearing his name, my grandmother next to him, and there in the foreground, maybe 7 or 8 years old, was my mother. She was holding a small printed invitation, showing it to the camera with a huge smile. I flipped the photo over. The back read, Linda's first solo project. So proud of our girl. June 1987. My mother had worked at Pierce Printing, had learned the business, had been proud of it once before Bob convinced her it was worthless. I slipped the photo into my pocket and started packing everything back into the boxes. But I kept out the crucial documents, the ones that told the story of how Bob Caldwell had stolen my family's legacy. Outside, the afternoon had grown thick with heat. I loaded the boxes of documents into my car, not bothering to be subtle about it. If my mother wanted to accuse me of stealing, she could try. But these were my family's papers too. My history. My inheritance. My truth. I drove home through Saturday afternoon traffic, my mind already working through what came next. I needed a lawyer. Someone who specialized in estate fraud and financial manipulation. Someone who wouldn't be impressed by Bob's reputation or intimidated by his money. And I needed to talk to my father, David Pierce, who'd been cut out of my life 20 years ago when my parents divorced. Who'd moved to Colorado and remarried and built a new life. Who I'd barely spoken to in the last decade because my mother had made it clear that maintaining a relationship with him was a betrayal of her. My father, who'd probably been asking questions about Pierce Printing's sale for years and been told to mind his own business. I pulled into my apartment complex just as Jordan was getting dropped off by Matt's mom. He waved goodbye to his friend and headed over to my car, stopping when he saw the boxes in the back seat. What's all that? History, I said. And maybe justice if we're lucky. He helped me carry everything inside, stacking boxes in the corner of my bedroom where they wouldn't be in the way but also wouldn't be forgotten. When we finished, he looked at me with that too serious expression he got when he was trying to figure out if his mom was okay or spiraling. I'm okay, I said before he could ask. I'm actually better than okay. I'm angry. And anger, it turns out, is a lot more useful than sadness. Jordan nodded slowly. So what now? Now, I said, we order pizza. And tomorrow we start building a case. We ate dinner on the couch, watching a movie neither of us paid attention to, both lost in our own thoughts. My phone stayed off, sitting on the counter like a small bomb. I wasn't ready to detonate. Eventually Jordan went to bed and I sat alone in the dark, thinking about breadsticks and betrayal and all the ways family could fail you while insisting they were helping. Outside, Austin hummed with its usual Saturday night energy. Music drifting from somewhere down the street. Cars passing. The world continuing on, indifferent to the small revolutions happening in ground-floor apartments. I thought about my mother, probably at home in Westlake, Bob beside her, both of them convinced I'd come crawling back with apologies. About Brian, who'd never had to work for anything and never would. About Jordan, who deserved so much better than breadsticks and second-class status. And about myself, 38 years old and finally understanding that you couldn't earn love from people who'd already decided you weren't worth it. The documents sat in the corner, patient and damning. Tomorrow I'd start making calls. But tonight, I let myself sit with the anger, feel its heat and weight, let it burn away the last remnants of guilt for wanting more than scraps from my own family's table. Outside, a car alarm went off and then stopped. The night settled back into its rhythm. And I sat there in the dark, planning war. Sunday morning arrived with the particular quality of light that made Austin feel like a postcard. All golden and promising and full of possibility. I woke up early, my mind already racing through the list of things I needed to do. People I needed to call. Questions I needed answers to. Jordan was still asleep, his door closed, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of someone's dog barking in the courtyard. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop, surrounded by the documents I'd brought home from the storage unit. In the clear light of morning, they looked less like historical artifacts and more like ammunition. The first call I needed to make was the hardest one. I pulled up my father's number in my phone, a contact I barely used in the last 5 years. We exchanged texts on birthdays and holidays, brief messages that carried the weight of everything we didn't say. How are you? Fine, hope you're well, take care. The scaffolding of a relationship that had collapsed under the pressure of divorce and distance and my mother's very clear expectation that loving her meant choosing sides. I stared at his name on the screen for a full minute before finally pressing call. It rang 4 times and I was preparing to leave a voicemail when he answered, his voice cautious and surprised. Amanda? Hey Dad, I said, and my voice cracked on the second word, which I hadn't expected. Is everything okay? Is Jordan all right? Jordan's fine, I said quickly. We're both fine. I just needed to talk to you about something. About the family business. There was a pause, long enough that I thought maybe the connection had dropped. Then my father's voice came back, different now, sharper. What about it? I found the documents, I said. In Mom's storage unit. The partnership agreement with Bob. The loan documents. The sale paperwork. Everything. Another pause, and when he spoke again I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Relief maybe, or validation. So you finally know, he said. I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask the right questions. We talked for over an hour. My father told me things I'd never known, pieces of history that my mother had carefully edited out of the family narrative. How Bob had appeared in the picture when my parents' marriage was already struggling, offering to help with the business while my grandfather dealt with my grandmother's failing health. How the help had slowly transformed into control, with Bob inserting himself into every decision, every contract, every financial choice. How my father had tried to warn my grandfather that something felt wrong, that Bob's interest seemed less than altruistic, but by then everyone was too tired and too desperate to question a lifeline. My father had tried to fight the sale after my grandfather died, had hired a lawyer to look into whether everything was legal and above board. But my mother had already made her choice by then, already aligned herself with Bob, already convinced herself or been convinced that my father was just bitter about the divorce and trying to cause trouble. The lawyer had found irregularities, clauses in the partnership agreement that didn't quite add up, loan terms that bordered on predatory. But without my mother's cooperation, without access to all the documents, there wasn't enough to build a case. And then my parents' divorce had become final, and my mother had made it clear that my father was no longer welcome in any family business, literal or figurative. So he'd walked away, moved to Colorado, started over, and spent 2 decades wondering if he should have fought harder, knowing that fighting would have meant dragging me into the middle of a war I was too young to understand. I asked him if he still had any of the documents from back then, anything his lawyer had compiled. He said he'd kept everything packed away in his attic, just in case someday it mattered. Just in case someday, I called. Can you send me copies, I asked. Everything you have. Already scanning them, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I'll email them by tonight. We talked a little longer about Jordan and his photography, about my father's life in Denver, about all the years we'd missed because it was easier to stay away than to navigate my mother's minefield of loyalties. Before we hung up, my father said something that stuck with me. Amanda, whatever you decide to do with this information, I support you. But remember that your mother believed Bob because she wanted to. She chose this. That doesn't make what he did right, but it means she's not just a victim. She's complicit. I thanked him and ended the call, sitting with those words. Complicit. Not just manipulated or deceived, but actively participating in the erasure of my inheritance, the dismantling of my grandfather's legacy, the construction of a new family narrative where Bob was the hero and anyone who questioned him was the villain. Jordan emerged from his room around 10, shuffling into the kitchen in sweatpants and a photography club t-shirt, his hair sticking up in 3 different directions. Morning, he mumbled, heading straight for the cereal cabinet. I watched him pour a bowl of the off-brand cornflakes we bought because they were cheaper, adding milk we'd stretch to last until my next paycheck. Meanwhile, across town in Westlake, Brian's daughters were probably eating fresh fruit and organic yogurt in a kitchen 3 times the size of our entire apartment, never once thinking about the cost or the effort or the inheritance that had paid for their comfortable life. How are you doing? I asked Jordan. He shrugged, chewing thoughtfully. Okay, I guess. Matt's family invited me to go to Schlitterbahn next weekend. I told him I'd have to ask you. The water park, an hour outside Austin, admission tickets that cost what I usually spent on groceries for a week. I opened my mouth to say maybe, or we'll see, or the gentle no's I'd gotten good at delivering. But then I thought about Bob's smug face, about breadsticks and inheritance and all the ways I'd learned to make myself smaller so other people could be comfortable. Yeah, I said. That sounds fun. You should go. Jordan looked up, surprised. Really? Really? Consider it an early birthday present. He grinned, actually grinned, and went back to his cereal with renewed enthusiasm. After breakfast, I did something I'd been avoiding. I turned my phone back on. The messages came flooding in, dozens of them, a tidal wave of family outrage and concern and manipulation. My mother had clearly rallied the troops, because suddenly cousins I hadn't heard from in years were texting to tell me how disappointed they were in my behavior, how I needed to apologize to Bob, how family was supposed to forgive and forget. Aunt Stephanie, my mother's sister, sent a long message about how Bob had always been nothing but generous and I was being childish and cruel. My mother's best friend Carol, who I barely knew, texted to say she was praying for me to find my way back to kindness. And Bob himself had sent 3 more messages, each one escalating in tone from disappointed to angry to coldly threatening. The last one, sent at 2 in the morning, read simply, "You have no idea what you've started." But he was wrong. I knew exactly what I'd started. I'd started telling the truth. I ignored all of them and instead texted my best friend Nicole, the only person in my life who'd consistently seen through my family's carefully maintained facade. "Hey, are you working today?" Her response came back immediately. "Off until Tuesday." "What's up? Can you come over? I need advice and possibly a witness in case I completely lose my mind." "On my way. Bring coffee." Nicole arrived 40 minutes later with 2 large iced coffees from our favorite place on South Congress, and a bag of collages, because she was the kind of friend who understood that crisis required carbs. She took one look at my face, at the documents spread across my kitchen table, at Jordan quietly retreating to his room to give us privacy, and said, "Okay, what did they do now?" I told her. Everything. The dinner. The breadstick. The confrontation. The storage unit. The documents. My father's revelations. Bob's threatening text. I laid it all out like evidence in a trial, and Nicole listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from sympathetic to horrified to furiously angry. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said a word that would have gotten Jordan grounded if he'd used it. "That absolute piece of garbage," she said. "I mean, I've always known Bob was smarmy, but this is criminal. Literal fraud." "Might be," I said. "I need to talk to a lawyer." Someone who can tell me if there's enough here to actually do something or if it's too late, if whatever statute of limitations exists has already passed. Nicole pulled out her phone, scrolling through contacts. My cousin Marcus is a lawyer. Estate law. He owes me a favor because I covered his ear bill last year when he didn't have insurance. Let me text him. While she typed, I sipped my coffee and tried to organize my thoughts. Part of me still couldn't quite believe what I'd discovered, couldn't reconcile the documents with the family narrative I'd been fed my entire adult life. But another part of me, the part that had watched Jordan reach for a breadstick while his cousins ate shrimp, that part knew every word was true. Nicole's phone buzzed. Marcus says he can meet with you tomorrow afternoon. His office is downtown. I'll text you the address. Thank you, I said, and meant it for more than just the lawyer connection. For being here. For believing me. For not telling me to just let it go and keep the peace. Nicole reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Amanda, you've spent your whole life keeping the peace. Look where it got you. Sometimes the only way forward is through the fire. She left around noon, taking the empty coffee cups and leaving me with a sense that maybe, possibly, I wasn't crazy. That what I'd found actually mattered. That standing up at that dinner hadn't been an overreaction but the first step towards something larger. The rest of Sunday passed in a strange limbo. Jordan and I went to the grocery store. A normal activity that felt surreal given everything else. We walked through the fluorescent-lit aisles, comparing prices and checking what was on sale. The mundane mathematics of stretching a budget. I found myself doing the math differently this time, though. Not just what can we afford, but what was taken from us. What Jordan should have inherited. What his life might have looked like if Bob hadn't systematically stripped away his grandfather's legacy. We made spaghetti for dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and sauce from a jar and garlic bread from the frozen section. We ate on the couch watching a nature documentary, Jordan providing running commentary about camera angles and lighting choices. It was peaceful. Normal. The kind of evening I'd built our life around, small and quiet in ours. My phone buzzed with another message from my mother. Amanda, this has gone on long enough. We need to talk face to face. Come to the house tomorrow evening. 6 o'clock. Don't bring Jordan. This is between adults. I read it twice, analyzing the word choices. The imperative tone. The assumption that I'd simply comply. The instruction not to bring my son, as if he were the problem rather than a witness to their behavior. I typed and deleted 3 different responses before finally settling on. I'm not coming to your house. If you want to talk, we can meet somewhere public. Neutral ground. The response came back within seconds. Fine. Magnolia Cafe. 6:30. I knew the place she meant, the location on Lake Austin Boulevard. Far enough from both our neighborhoods to feel neutral but close enough that neither of us had an excuse not to show. I agreed, then immediately texted Nicole. Meeting my mom tomorrow night at Magnolia. Can you be on standby in case I need an emergency exit? She sent back a gif of a soldier saluting and the message, I'll be in the parking lot. Say the word and I'll fake a medical emergency. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the apartment complex settling into night. Someone's television murmuring through the walls. A car door slamming. The distant wail of a siren heading down Lamar Boulevard. I thought about my grandfather, who I barely remembered except in fragments. The smell of ink and paper. His laugh deep and booming. The way he'd let me play in the print shop after hours, teaching me how to line up letters on the old press, how to check for smudges, how to take pride in work well done. He'd built something. Not something huge or flashy or impressive by Austin's current standards, but something real. Something that employed people and served the community and carried his name. And Bob had taken it apart like a vulture picking at a carcass, all while convincing my mother he was helping. Monday morning arrived gray and humid. The kind of weather that promised afternoon thunderstorms. I dropped Jordan at school and headed to my own work, trying to focus on the freelance design projects I had due. But my mind kept drifting to the documents, to the meeting with the lawyer that afternoon, to the confrontation with my mother that evening. Around 11, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was spam, but something made me pick up. Amanda Pierce? A woman's voice asked. This is Catherine Hendricks. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but your name came up in a search alert I have set up for Robert Caldwell. I sat up straighter, my pulse quickening. Catherine Hendricks. The woman who'd sued Bob 3 years ago. How did you get my number? Your friend Nicole gave it to me. She reached out to my cousin who works at Del Seaton. And well, the medical community in Austin is smaller than you'd think. I have information about Bob Caldwell that you might find useful. And I'd really like to talk to someone who might actually believe me. We agreed to meet for coffee that afternoon, before my appointment with the lawyer. She suggested a place in Hyde Park, quiet and away from downtown where we were less likely to run into anyone we knew. I got there early and ordered a tea I didn't really want, sitting at a table in the back corner where I could see the door. Catherine arrived right on time, a woman in her mid-50s with short gray hair and sharp eyes. She ordered nothing, just sat down across from me and said, "So you're finally asking questions about Bob." Took long enough. For the next hour, Catherine told me her story. How she'd worked for Caldwell Insurance for 6 years, starting as a claims processor, and working her way up to senior account manager. How she'd noticed irregularities in how Bob handled certain claims, particularly ones involving older clients or complicated estates. How he'd pressure clients to purchase unnecessary policies, to name his company as beneficiary on certain accounts, to sign documents they didn't fully understand. When she'd raised concerns, internally, she'd been told to mind her own business. When she'd persisted, she'd been demoted. And when she'd started documenting everything, she'd been fired for supposed performance issues that had never existed before she became inconvenient. She'd sued, and Bob had settled quickly, throwing money at the problem along with an NDA that prevented her from publicly discussing anything about her employment or the reasons for her termination. But NDAs, Catherine said, leaning forward, don't prevent me from discussing general patterns of behavior. They don't prevent me from suggesting that someone else look into Bob's business practices. And they don't prevent me from mentioning that I kept copies of certain documents that I really shouldn't have kept. Just in case. Do you still have them? I asked. She smiled, thin and satisfied. Let's just say that if you end up in a legal situation where you need evidence of a pattern of fraudulent behavior, I might be able to point you towards some very interesting insurance claims from the late 90s. Claims involving elderly clients who suddenly needed to restructure their estates. Claims that just happened to benefit Caldwell Holdings. She slid a business card across the table. That's my personal cell. If you decide to do something about Bob, call me. I'll help however I can. After Catherine left, I sat in the coffee shop for another 20 minutes, trying to process everything. Bob wasn't just a man who'd taken advantage of one vulnerable situation. He was a predator with a pattern. Someone who'd built his entire empire on exploiting people who trusted him. And my mother had married him anyway. Had either not seen it or not cared. Had prioritized her own security over the truth. The lawyer's office was in a converted house near downtown. The kind of place that managed to feel both professional and approachable. Marcus Chun turned out to be younger than I expected, maybe 40, with an easy smile that made me relax slightly. Nicole had briefed him on the basics so I didn't have to start from scratch. I spread the documents across his conference table and watched him work through them methodically, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more serious as he read. After about 30 minutes he sat back and looked at me. "This is ugly," he said. "Potentially criminal, definitely unethical, and absolutely grounds for a civil case. The question is whether the statute of limitations has expired, and whether we can prove your mother wasn't acting in her own best interest when she signed these agreements. She was the executor of the estate. She had the legal authority to make these decisions. Even if they were bad decisions, unless we can prove she was being coerced or was mentally incompetent at the time, which seems unlikely given how carefully everything was documented." He flipped through more pages. "But there might be another angle. If we can prove that Bob engaged in fraud, that he misrepresented the value of the business or concealed material facts during the sale, that might give us an opening. Fraud has a longer statute of limitations because the clock doesn't start until you discover the fraud." "And I just discovered it," I said. "Exactly. Plus, if we can establish a pattern of similar behavior with other clients, that strengthens the case that this wasn't just a bad business deal but a deliberate scheme." Which is where Catherine Hendricks comes in. I told him about the meeting, about her hints at documentation. He made a note of her name. "Let me do some research," Marcus said. "Look into case law, see what's possible. But Amanda, I need you to understand that even if we have a case, this is going to be expensive and ugly. Bob will fight hard. Your mother will have to choose sides, and she's already shown you which side she's on. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Jordan reaching for a breadstick. About years of being told I was too sensitive, too demanding, too ungrateful. About the life my son could have had if his inheritance hadn't been stolen. Yes, I said. I'm prepared. Marcus nodded. Then let's build a case. I left his office feeling both energized and terrified. The way you feel standing at the edge of something you can't come back from. The meeting with my mother was in 2 hours. I drove home to change, choosing my outfit carefully. Nothing too casual, nothing too formal. I wanted to look put together, unbothered, like someone who hadn't spent the last 48 hours unearthing family secrets and planning legal warfare. Jordan was home from school, doing homework at the kitchen table. Where are you going? He asked, looking up from his math textbook. Meeting your grandmother, I said. Just to talk. His expression closed off the way it always did when my mother came up. Want me to come? No, sweetheart. This is something I need to handle alone. But thank you for offering. He nodded and went back to his homework, but I could feel his worry following me as I grabbed my purse and keys. Nicole texted as I was walking to my car. In position. Parked on the street with a clear view of the entrance. You got this. The drive to Magnolia Cafe took 20 minutes through late afternoon traffic. The restaurant sat in a strip mall, its neon sign visible from the street, the parking lot already filling up with the early dinner crowd. I found a spot near the back and sat in my car for a moment, breathing, centering myself, remembering what my therapist used to say about staying grounded in difficult conversations. You don't have to defend yourself. You don't have to make them understand. You just have to tell your truth and let them react however they're going to react. My mother's silver Lexus pulled into the lot right at 6:30, parking in a spot near the entrance where everyone could see. She got out wearing cream-colored slacks and a silk blouse, her hair perfect, her sunglasses expensive. She looked exactly like what she was. A woman who'd married well and never had to worry about money again. I got out of my car and walked toward the entrance, meeting her at the door. We didn't hug. Didn't touch. Just acknowledged each other with slight nods and went inside. The hostess seated us at a booth in the back, away from the windows. My mother ordered hot tea. I ordered water. We sat across from each other, the table between us feeling like a demilitarized zone. Well, my mother said, folding her hands on the table. Are you ready to apologize? For what, exactly? For your behavior at my birthday dinner. For the scene you caused. For refusing to answer my calls. For whatever's gotten into you lately that's made you forget how families are supposed to treat each other. I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. Mom, I found the documents. From the storage unit. About Pierce Printing and Bob's partnership and the sale. The color drained from her face just slightly. Just enough that I knew she understood exactly what I was talking about. Those are private family papers, she said, her voice tight. You had no right. I had every right. They're my family too. My inheritance that somehow disappeared. My grandfather's business that somehow ended up in Bob's portfolio. She looked away, her jaw clenched. You don't understand the situation. Your grandfather was dying. Your grandmother couldn't manage things. We needed help. So Bob helped himself to half the value of the business? Mom, I've seen the valuation documents. I know what Pierce Printing was worth when it sold and what Bob paid for it. That wasn't help. That was theft. Lower your voice, my mother hissed, glancing around to see if anyone was listening. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You're making accusations you can't prove about a man who's only ever tried to support this family. I pulled out my phone, opening the photos I'd taken of the documents. I can prove it, I said quietly. I have the partnership agreement showing the terms, the loan documents showing the interest rates, the sale agreement showing the price. And I have a lawyer who says there might be grounds for a fraud case. My mother's face went from pale to flushed, spots of color appearing on her cheeks. You're going to sue Bob? You're going to drag your own family through court over business decisions that happened decades ago? That's what it takes to get answers, yes. She laughed, sharp and bitter. You always were dramatic, Amanda. Just like your father. Always seeing conspiracy where there was just people trying to survive. This isn't about drama, Mom. This is about you signing away my inheritance. About Bob manipulating a grieving woman to get control of her husband's business. About you choosing his money over your own daughter's future. I chose stability, my mother said coldly. I chose security after years of struggling with your father. I chose a man who could provide for me instead of a man who could barely keep a printing business afloat. Bob saved me. Saved us. And you've been ungrateful ever since. There it was. The truth she'd been dancing around for years. She hadn't been manipulated. She'd been complicit. Had known exactly what she was doing when she signed those papers, when she let Bob dismantle my grandfather's legacy. Had chosen comfort over integrity and convinced herself it was the right choice. And what about me, I asked, my voice cracking despite my efforts to stay calm. What about my share of the inheritance? What about Jordan's future? You got to make choices, Mom. When do I get that same opportunity? You had choices, she said. You chose to have a baby at 23. You chose to divorce Jordan's father. You chose to work in a field that doesn't pay well instead of getting a real job. You've made nothing but poor choices your entire adult life. And now you want to blame Bob for the consequences. The words landed like slaps, each one calculated to hit where I was most vulnerable. And in that moment, I understood that this wasn't going to end in understanding or reconciliation, or her suddenly seeing the light and admitting fault. This was who she was. Who she'd always been. Someone who measured love in terms of compliance, and saw her daughter's independence as a personal affront. I stood up, leaving money on the table for my water I hadn't touched. I'm done, I said. Done trying to earn your approval. Done pretending that Bob is anything other than what he is. Done letting you make me feel like wanting basic fairness is asking too much. Amanda, sit down, my mother said, her voice sharp with authority. We're not finished. Yes, I said. We are. I walked out of Magnolia Cafe into the parking lot, where the sky had opened up with the promised afternoon storm, rain coming down in sheets. I didn't run to my car. Just walked through it, letting the water soak my hair and clothes, letting it wash away whatever remained of the daughter who'd kept trying to win her mother's love. Nicole's car pulled up beside me, window rolling down. Get in, she yelled over the rain. I got in, dripping water all over her passenger seat. She handed me a towel from her gym bag and didn't ask questions, just drove, the wipers beating against the windshield, the storm making the world outside soft and blurred. After a few blocks she said, "Where to?" "Home," I said. "I need to be with Jordan." She nodded and turned the car south, toward the apartment complex where my son was waiting, where the life I'd built waited, small and imperfect but honestly mine. We pulled into the parking lot and Nicole turned to me. "You okay?" I thought about it, really thought about it. "No," I said. "But I will be." That night, after Nicole left and Jordan was in bed and the storm had passed, I sat on my small balcony watching the clouds clear to reveal stars. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text read, "This is your last warning. Drop this or face the consequences. Bob." I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Marcus the lawyer. Then I typed a response. "See you in court. Tomorrow I'd call Catherine and get those documents. Tomorrow I'd ask my father to send everything his lawyer had compiled years ago. Tomorrow I'd start building the case that would either vindicate me or destroy what little remained of my family relationships. But tonight, I just sat in the dark and breathed, listening to Austin settle into night around me, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, not peace, but purpose. The kind that comes from finally choosing yourself. The weeks that followed the confrontation at Magnolia Cafe felt like living in two timelines simultaneously. In one timeline, life continued with its normal rhythms. Jordan went to school, took photos, hung out with Matt. I worked on design projects, paid bills, grocery shopped. We watched movies on Friday nights and did laundry on Sundays and existed in the small comfortable routines we'd built together. But in the other timeline, the one that hummed beneath the surface of everything, I was building a case against my stepfather and preparing for a legal battle that would either reclaim what was stolen or confirm that some injustices were too old to fix. Marcus called 3 days after our initial meeting with news that the statute of limitations situation was more complicated than he'd hoped but not impossible. Texas law gave us 4 years from the date we discovered the fraud, which meant we had a window. But we'd need to prove not just that the sale was unfair, but that Bob had actively concealed material facts or misrepresented the business's value. That's where Catherine Hendricks became crucial. She met me at a park near Zilker on a Wednesday afternoon, carrying a messenger bag that she handled like it contained nuclear codes. We sat at a picnic table under a massive live oak, the spring air thick with pollen and the sound of kids playing on the nearby playground. Catherine pulled out a folder, but before handing it over she looked at me seriously. What I'm giving you I got through means that weren't exactly legal when I left the company. I made copies of files I shouldn't have had access to. If this goes to court, my methods will be questioned. I need to know you're really committed to this, that you're not going to back down when Bob starts playing dirty. I thought about Jordan's face at that dinner table, about the breadstick, about all the years of being made to feel like I was asking for too much when I was really just asking for basic dignity. I'm committed, I said. She nodded and slid the folder across the weathered wood. Inside were copies of insurance claims dating back to the late 90s and early 2000s. Elderly clients whose policies had been restructured shortly before they died. Estate settlements that somehow benefited Caldwell Holdings more than the named beneficiaries. A pattern of Bob positioning himself as a helpful advisor, and then maneuvering assets into his own control. One case in particular stood out. A widow named Margaret Torres who'd come to Bob after her husband died in 2001. She'd had a life insurance policy worth $300,000 and Bob had convinced her to invest it in what he called a guaranteed growth account that would provide income for her retirement. The account was managed by a subsidiary of Caldwell Holdings. When Margaret died 6 years later, her children discovered that most of the money had been eaten up by management fees, and the remaining balance went to paying off loans she'd supposedly taken against the account. Loans she'd never understood she was taking. Loans that benefited Bob's company. The children had threatened to sue but settled quietly when Bob offered them $50,000 and promised the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Catherine had included their contact information. They might be willing to testify, she said, if it meant finally holding Bob accountable. I photographed every page, then handed the originals back. Catherine shook her head. Keep them. I've got copies of copies. And Amanda, be careful. Bob's gotten away with this for decades because he's good at making problems disappear. Don't underestimate him. I promised I wouldn't and we parted ways, her warning echoing in my head as I drove home. That night I called the Torres children, now adults in their 40s living in San Antonio. The daughter, Patricia, answered with immediate suspicion when I explained who I was and why I was calling. After all these years, she said, her voice tight with old anger, someone's finally asking questions about Bob Caldwell? We tried to tell people back then that something was wrong. Our lawyer said we didn't have enough evidence to win. That Mom had signed all the paperwork. That it would cost more to fight than we'd ever recover. I told her about my situation, about Pierce Printing and the inheritance that had disappeared and the pattern that seemed to follow Bob wherever he went. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, my mother trusted him. She was lonely after Dad died and Bob was so charming, so helpful. He made her feel taken care of. And he robbed her blind while smiling to her face. If there's a way to make sure he doesn't do this to anyone else, if there's something we can do to help, we're in. I added their names to the growing list of people who might testify if this went to trial. The list was getting longer. Catherine, Patricia Torres, and her brother Miguel. My father, who could speak to the circumstances around the original partnership. Jordan, who could testify about the pattern of favoritism and mistreatment. And potentially others, people whose names appeared in the documents Catherine had provided, victims who might still be angry enough to speak up. Marcus filed preliminary paperwork in late June, requesting access to more detailed financial records from the Pierce Printing sale and from Caldwell Holdings' business practices during that period. Bob's lawyers responded within 48 hours with a motion to dismiss, claiming the case had no merit and was simply a disgruntled family member trying to relitigate old business decisions. The motion to dismiss hearing was scheduled for mid-July in Travis County Courthouse downtown. I took the morning off work, dressed in the most professional outfit I owned, and met Marcus in the hallway outside the courtroom. Bob was already there with his legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits who looked like they ate small civil cases for breakfast. Bob himself wore a navy suit and an expression of supreme confidence, the look of a man who'd never lost anything that mattered. My mother stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her face carefully neutral. She wouldn't look at me. Brian was there too, lurking near the vending machines, his presence more about support for his father than any actual interest in legal proceedings. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Sandra Morales, with sharp eyes and a reputation for not tolerating nonsense. She reviewed the preliminary filings, asked some clarifying questions, and then looked at Bob's lawyers. "You're asking me to dismiss a case involving potential estate fraud before any discovery has occurred? That seems premature." "Your Honor," Bob's lead attorney said smoothly, "this is clearly a case of buyer's remorse decades after the fact. Miss Pierce's mother was the executor of the estate and had full legal authority to sell the business. The sale was completed properly, all documents were signed, and Miss Pierce is simply unhappy that her family's business is no longer in family hands." Judge Morales turned to Marcus. "Counselor?" "Your Honor," Marcus said, standing, "we're not claiming the sale was improperly executed. We're claiming it was fraudulent from the start. That Mr. Caldwell used his position as a business partner to manipulate the terms, to undervalue the assets, and to pressure a grieving widow into accepting less than fair market value. We have evidence suggesting this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of similar behavior with other clients. We're requesting the opportunity to conduct discovery and present that evidence." The judge looked at the documents in front of her, then at Bob, then at me. "I'm going to allow limited discovery," she said. "Mr. Caldwell, you'll need to produce financial records related to the Pierce Printing acquisition and sale. Ms. Pierce's legal team will have 60 days to review those records and determine if there's sufficient evidence to proceed. If they can establish probable cause for fraud, we'll move forward with a full trial. If not, the case is dismissed with prejudice." The gavel came down and Bob's confident expression flickered, just for a second, before resettling into place. In the hallway afterward, my mother finally approached me. She looked older somehow, the careful maintenance of her appearance not quite hiding the strain underneath. "You're really doing this," she said quietly. "Dragging our family through the courts. Making everything public." "I'm trying to recover what was stolen, Mom. There's a difference." She shook her head, her mouth tight. "You're going to lose. Bob has the best lawyers in Austin. And even if by some miracle you win, you think I'm going to thank you? You think this makes us family again?" "No," I said. "I know exactly where we stand. I just want the truth on record." She walked away without another word and I watched her go, feeling nothing but a tired sort of relief. The grief of losing her had already happened years ago, in 1,000 small moments of choosing Bob over me. This was just making it official. The discovery process was slow and frustrating. Bob's lawyers produced thousands of pages of documents, most of them irrelevant, clearly hoping to bury anything useful under a mountain of paperwork. But Marcus had worked on cases like this before and knew what to look for. He hired a forensic accountant who spent 3 weeks going through every transaction related to Pierce Printing's sale and Caldwell Holdings' business dealings from that period. In late August, the accountant delivered her report. The business had been undervalued by at least 40% at the time of sale. Multiple assets had been quietly transferred to Caldwell Holdings before the official sale, reducing the apparent value of what was being purchased. And the loans Bob's company had made to Pierce Printing in the months before my grandfather's death carried interest rates that would have been considered usurious in any other context. Armed with this information, Marcus filed an amended complaint with additional evidence and a request to expand discovery to include Bob's other business dealings. This time, the response from Bob's lawyers was different. Less dismissive. More defensive. They filed motions to limit what could be examined, claiming it was a fishing expedition, that my legal team was trying to access confidential business information that had nothing to do with the original complaint. Judge Morales disagreed and gave us broader access. That's when things started getting ugly. In September, someone contacted my landlord claiming there were noise complaints about our apartment and suggesting he should reconsider our lease. The landlord, thankfully, called me first to ask what was going on. I had to explain the situation, had to assure him we weren't causing problems, had to wonder who would stoop to trying to get us evicted. Then Jordan came home from school upset because someone had told his photography teacher that he'd been caught plagiarizing images online. It was completely false, but he had to spend an afternoon defending himself and showing his original files and metadata to prove the photos were his. Someone broke into my car while it was parked at the grocery store, rifling through the glove compartment and leaving everything scattered but stealing nothing. Just leaving a message that they could get to me whenever they wanted. I documented everything, sent reports to Marcus, filed police reports that went nowhere because there was never enough evidence to trace anything back to Bob. But I knew. And he knew I knew. The intimidation tactics just made me angrier, more determined. Nicole became my anchor through all of it, showing up with food when I forgot to eat, taking Jordan to a movie when the stress in our apartment got too thick, reminding me that I wasn't crazy and that fighting back wasn't the same as being vindictive. My father called every week from Colorado, offering support and encouragement and stories about his own battles with Bob years ago. And Jordan, my wise beyond his years son, took photos through it all. He documented our life during this period like he was creating a visual diary. Photos of me working late at the kitchen table surrounded by legal documents. Photos of the courthouse. Photos of our small apartment that somehow looked beautiful through his lens, proof that you could have very little and still have everything that mattered. In October, we got a break. One of the other clients Catherine had identified, a man named Thomas Way whose father had lost a significant portion of his estate through one of Bob's investment schemes, agreed to testify. And Patricia Torres found documents her mother had saved, letters from Bob promising returns that never materialized, statements showing fees that made no sense. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Marcus filed a motion for summary judgment on certain aspects of the case, arguing that the evidence of fraud was clear enough that some elements didn't need to go to trial. Bob's lawyers fought it, but Judge Morales agreed to hold a hearing. The hearing took place on a gray November morning that threatened rain. The courthouse was busier than last time, the hallways full of people dealing with their own legal battles. I sat beside Marcus at our table while Bob and his lawyers sat across the aisle. My mother wasn't there this time. Brian was, though, along with Bob's current wife, a woman he'd married after my mother died 3 years ago in a car accident I'd only learned about through a brief text from a distant cousin. Wait, I realized as I looked at Bob's wife. My mother was dead. Had died 3 years ago and nobody had told me. Brian caught me staring and smirked. Guess you didn't make the notification list, he mouthed. The rage that filled me was white-hot and cleansing. She died and they hadn't even told me. Had cut me out so completely that I'd missed my own mother's funeral. Jordan had lost his grandmother and didn't even know. I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles went white, breathing through the fury. Marcus noticed and leaned close. You okay? No, I said. But I will be. The judge entered and we all stood. She reviewed the evidence Marcus had submitted, asked pointed questions about the undervaluation of Pierce Printing, about the pattern of similar behavior with other clients, about the interest rates on those loans. Bob's lawyers argued that business decisions made under pressure weren't the same as fraud, that my mother had been a willing participant in all of this, that I was trying to use the legal system to undo choices I didn't like. The judge listened, made notes, asked more questions. When both sides had presented their arguments, she sat back and considered. I'm going to grant partial summary judgment, she said finally. The evidence is clear that Pierce Printing was substantially undervalued at the time of sale, and that Mr. Caldwell, as both a business partner and the buyer, had a fiduciary duty to ensure fair market value was paid. The question of whether this rises to criminal fraud or is simply a civil matter of breach of fiduciary duty will be determined at trial, but there's sufficient evidence to proceed. Trial is set for February. The gavel came down. Bob's face had gone red. His jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break his teeth. His lawyers immediately started talking about appeals and procedural options. Marcus was smiling, actually smiling. This is good, he told me as we packed up our materials. This is really good. Bob left the courtroom without looking at me, his lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. Brian stayed behind, though, approaching our table with that same smirk. You know you're not getting anything, right? Even if you win, it's all tied up in trusts and corporations. You'll spend years trying to collect and Dad will be dead before you see a penny. Maybe, I said. But it'll be on record. Everyone will know what he did. What you all did. And that's worth something. Brian's smirk faltered. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say more, then thought better of it and left. I stood in the empty courtroom for a moment, just breathing. Marcus touched my shoulder. You did good today. I shook my head. I haven't done anything yet. The trial's where it matters. He smiled. Then let's make sure we're ready. The months between November and February passed in a blur of preparation. Depositions with witnesses. Strategy sessions with Marcus. reviewing documents until I could recite them from memory. Catherine was deposed and held up beautifully under questioning from Bob's lawyers, never wavering in her testimony about the pattern of behavior she'd witnessed. Patricia Torres and her brother were deposed and described in heartbreaking detail how Bob had exploited their mother's grief and confusion. Thomas Way testified about similar experiences with his father. And my own father flew in from Colorado to give a deposition about the early days of Bob's involvement with Pierce Printing, about the concerns he'd raised that were dismissed, about the pressure he'd felt to stay quiet or risk losing access to me. Jordan turned 15 in January and asked if he could attend the trial. I wasn't sure at first, didn't want him to see the ugliness of legal warfare up close. But he insisted. This is about our family, Mom. About what was taken from us. I want to be there. So I agreed. The trial began on a cold February morning. The kind of cold that's rare in Austin but cuts through you when it arrives. The courthouse steps were slick with frost and the sky was gray and heavy. Inside, the courtroom was warmer but felt just as cold. The wooden benches hard and unforgiving, the fluorescent lights harsh overhead. Judge Morales presided with the same sharp attention she'd shown throughout the process. The jury was made up of 12 people who looked tired already, probably wondering why they'd been called to serve on what was clearly going to be a long and complicated case. Bob sat at the defense table looking confident and wronged, the picture of a successful businessman being persecuted by an ungrateful stepdaughter. His legal team had clearly coached him well. Marcus gave our opening statement, laying out the case simply and clearly. A family business built over generations. A vulnerable widow grieving her husband. A trusted partner who exploited that vulnerability for personal gain. And a pattern of similar behavior that proved this wasn't an accident but a calculated scheme. Bob's lead attorney countered by painting me as bitter and jealous, someone who'd made poor life choices and was now trying to blame others for my own failures. He emphasized that my mother had been a willing participant in all of these decisions, that she'd had her own lawyer review everything, that she'd been competent and clear-minded when she signed the papers. It stung, hearing my life reduced to a series of failures, but I'd prepared for this. Knew they'd try to make me the villain. The first week of trial was mostly procedural, establishing the timeline, introducing documents, the forensic accountant walking the jury through the undervaluation of Pierce Printing, and explaining in painstaking detail how the numbers didn't add up. It was dry and technical but necessary. Jordan sat in the gallery behind me, taking notes occasionally, his camera in his bag because photos weren't allowed in court. During breaks he'd squeeze my shoulder or bring me water, his quiet support worth more than any legal argument. The second week was when the real testimony began. Catherine took the stand and described the culture at Caldwell Insurance, the pressure to push products that benefited the company over the client, the way Bob had reacted when she'd raised concerns. Bob's lawyers tried to discredit her, bringing up the NDA, suggesting she was lying for revenge. But she held firm, her testimony measured and credible. Patricia Torres cried on the stand describing her mother's decline, how confused she'd been about the accounts and the loans, how Bob had assured them everything was fine right up until Margaret died and they discovered the money was gone. The jury paid close attention to her. You could see it registering the human cost of Bob's actions. My father testified on a Thursday, describing Bob's initial involvement with Pierce Printing and the concerns that had gone ignored. Bob's lawyers tried to suggest he was just a bitter ex-husband, but my father's testimony was too detailed, too specific. He'd kept records, had documentation, had tried to warn people. Then it was my turn. I took the stand on a Friday afternoon, my hand shaking slightly as I was sworn in. Marcus walked me through the story methodically. My relationship with my mother and Bob. The dinner at the Riverside Grill. Finding the documents. Realizing what had been taken. Bob's lawyers cross-examined me for hours, trying to poke holes in my story, suggesting I was motivated by greed, that I was a bad daughter trying to punish her stepfather for imagined slights. They brought up Jordan's father, my divorce, my financial struggles, every mistake I'd ever made. And I sat there and took it, answering honestly, refusing to be baited into anger. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, my life didn't turn out the way I planned. But none of that changes what Bob did. When they finally let me step down, I was exhausted. Jordan met me in the hallway, hugging me tight. You were amazing, he said. They tried to make you look bad and you just told the truth. That's all I've got, kiddo. The truth and stubbornness. The trial lasted 4 weeks total. Closing arguments happened on a Tuesday in early March. Marcus spoke about justice and accountability, and the importance of protecting vulnerable people from predators in business suits. Bob's lawyer spoke about the sanctity of business decisions, and the danger of second-guessing transactions decades after the fact just because you don't like the outcome. Then it went to the jury. They deliberated for 3 days. 3 days of waiting, of refreshing my phone constantly, of trying to work and failing to concentrate, of Jordan assuring me that whatever happened we'd be okay. On Friday afternoon, Marcus called. They've reached a verdict. We're due back in court in an hour. I grabbed Jordan and we drove downtown through traffic that felt both too slow and too fast. Nicole met us at the courthouse, having taken the afternoon off work to be there. My father had flown back to Colorado after testifying but called to say he'd be waiting by the phone. The courtroom filled with the principal players. Bob and his lawyers. Catherine in the gallery. Patricia Torres and her brother. Other people I recognized from depositions and documents. The jury filed in looking serious and tired. Judge Morales asked if they'd reached a verdict and the foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. In the matter of Pierce versus Caldwell Holdings, on the charge of fraudulent business practices, how do you find? We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Bob's face went from confident to shocked to enraged in the span of seconds. His lawyers immediately started talking about appeals. The foreman continued reading the verdict, finding Bob guilty on multiple counts related to the undervaluation and sale of Pierce Printing, to breach of fiduciary duty, to fraudulent misrepresentation. The jury awarded damages in the amount of $475,000, representing the lost value of my share of the inheritance plus interest accrued over the years. Judge Morales thanked the jury and scheduled a follow-up hearing for the following month to discuss payment and any additional remedies. Then it was over. Bob stormed out of the courtroom, his lawyers chasing after him. Brian followed, shooting me a look of pure hatred. But I barely noticed. I was too busy being hugged by Jordan, by Nicole, by Catherine, who whispered thank you for finishing what I couldn't. Marcus was grinning. We did it, he said. We actually did it. The victory felt surreal. $475,000 wouldn't replace the years of being treated as less than, wouldn't resurrect my relationship with my mother, wouldn't undo the damage. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was justice, imperfect and delayed but real. That night, Jordan and I went to Matt's house where they'd organized a small celebration. Nicole brought barbecue. My father called from Colorado and we all crowded around my phone speaker, while he told embarrassing stories from my childhood, and toasted to stubbornness being a virtue. It was simple and perfect and exactly what we needed. Over the following weeks, Bob's lawyers filed appeals but Judge Morales stood firm on the verdict. The damages were upheld. Bob was ordered to pay within 90 days or face additional penalties. He paid, finally, through several corporate accounts, the money appearing in my account on a Tuesday morning in May. I stared at the balance on my phone screen, the largest number I'd ever seen attached to my name. Jordan looked over my shoulder and whistled. That's a lot of zeros. It is, I said. And you know what it means? What? It means you're going to college without loans. It means we can move to a better apartment with actual working air conditioning. It means I can finally fix the car without holding my breath. It means we won. We moved in June to a 2-bedroom place in South Austin with a balcony and a view of the Greenbelt. Nothing fancy but ours, paid for with money that should have been mine all along. Jordan set up his photography equipment in the 2nd bedroom, turning it into a proper studio. I started taking on better freelance projects, the kind I'd been turning down because they didn't pay enough to justify the time. The kind I actually wanted to do. Nicole helped us move, naturally, and brought champagne to Kristen, the new place. We sat on the balcony that first night, watching the sun set over the trees, the Austin skyline visible in the distance. Catherine stopped by with a housewarming gift, a framed print of the Austin skyline at night. She hugged me at the door. You did something important, she said. Not just for yourself. For everyone Bob hurt. You made it matter. A few weeks later, I got a letter from Patricia Torres. Her family had filed their own case against Bob using similar evidence. Bob's lawyers were scrambling, his reputation crumbling. The man who'd spent decades looking respectable was finally being seen for what he was. I never heard from Bob again directly. Brian sent one final text calling me names I won't repeat. I blocked his number and moved on. My father visited in July, meeting Jordan properly for the first time in years. They bonded over cameras and Colorado hiking trails, and the family history my father could finally talk about without bitterness. On a warm August evening, Jordan and I drove out to Zilker Park, the place where I'd met Catherine that first time, where so much of this had started coming together. We walked down to Barton Springs, the natural pool fed by underground springs, the water cold and clear. Kids splashed in the shallow end while adults floated on their backs staring at the sky. We found a spot on the grassy hill overlooking the water and Jordan pulled out his camera, taking shots of the light filtering through the cypress trees. "Mom," he said after a while, not looking up from his viewfinder. "Yeah, I'm proud of you." I looked at my son, 15 now and growing into someone confident and kind, someone who documented truth and stood up for what mattered. The words stuck in my throat for a second. "I'm proud of us," I said finally. "We did this together." He smiled and went back to his photos. I lay back on the grass, staring up at the sky turning gold and pink with sunset. The fight had cost something. Had burned away whatever remained of my relationship with my mother's memory, with Brian, with the fantasy of a united family. But it had also freed something. Had proven that standing up for yourself wasn't selfish. That wanting fairness wasn't asking too much. That some bridges needed to burn so you could stop trying to cross them. Later, back at the apartment, I found Jordan working on something on his laptop. He turned the screen to show me. It was a photo essay he'd been building throughout the trial and after. Images of me at the kitchen table with documents. The courthouse. Our old apartment and our new one. Catherine. Nicole. My father. And at the center, a photo I hadn't known he'd taken. Me on the balcony of our new place, coffee in hand, looking out at the city with an expression that could only be described as peaceful. He'd titled the project What Family Really Means. Below the photos, he'd written a short essay. Family isn't about blood or obligation or staying quiet when you're hurt. Family is the people who show up, who believe you, who stand beside you when standing up costs something. Family is choosing each other every day not because you have to, but because you want to. My mom taught me that. Not with words but by refusing to accept less than we deserved. By fighting for truth even when it was hard. By showing me that love without respect isn't really love at all. I read it twice, tears blurring the words. Jordan watched me nervously. "Is it okay? I used some of our story." "It's perfect," I said. "You should submit it to your school's literary magazine." He grinned and saved the file. Later, lying in bed in my new room that didn't smell like mildew, I thought about the breadstick that had started everything. Such a small thing, such a casual cruelty, but it had been the final straw that broke through decades of conditioning to stay quiet and be grateful. I thought about my mother, who I'd never really known, who'd chosen security over integrity and convinced herself it was wisdom, who died without us reconciling because she'd cut me out so completely I hadn't even known she was gone. I felt sad about that but not guilty. I tried. I'd extended olive branches and swallowed hurt and kept showing up long past the point where it was healthy. Her choices had been hers to make. Mine had been mine. And I'd finally chosen myself. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Saw the photo essay Jordan posted. "That kid's going to change the world. He gets it from his mom." I smiled and typed back. "He gets it from both sides. Good genes and stubborn determination." The response came quickly. "The Pierce family legacy. Better than money in the bank." I set the phone down and closed my eyes, letting sleep come easily for the first time in months. In the morning, Jordan and I would go to the farmer's market. We'd buy fresh bread, the good kind, and vegetables we didn't have to check the price on. We'd come home and cook together, music playing, the windows open to let in the breeze. We'd live our small, hard-won life. And it would be enough. More than enough. It would be everything. The autumn air in Austin carried that particular quality of change, the kind that made you believe new beginnings were possible even after the hardest endings. I stood in the gallery space on East 6th Street, watching people file in for Jordan's first solo photography exhibition. At 16, my son had already developed a voice that critics were calling haunting and authentic, A perspective that captured truth in ways that made viewers uncomfortable in the best possible way. The exhibition was titled Inheritance, and every photograph told a story about what gets passed down through families. Not just money or property, but patterns in pain and the courage it takes to break cycles that have run for generations. Nicole arrived first, as she always did, carrying flowers and wearing a dress that meant she'd come straight from a wedding she'd been attending. She hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud, not just of Jordan but of me for getting us here. My father flew in from Colorado with his wife Susan, a kind woman who'd embraced the messy reality of blended families without trying to rewrite history. They stood near the entrance, my father's eyes bright with tears. He didn't bother hiding as he looked at his grandson's work displayed on clean white walls under perfect lighting. Catherine came with her partner, a woman who worked in nonprofit law, and had helped connect us with other families Bob had victimized over the years. There were 7 cases now, all moving through the courts, all using our case as precedent. Bob's empire was crumbling one lawsuit at a time, his name becoming synonymous with the kind of predatory business practices that destroyed families while hiding behind respectability. The centerpiece of Jordan's exhibition was a triptych he'd titled the Breadbasket Series. 3 large photographs, each one capturing a different moment from that dinner at the Riverside Grill 2 years ago. In the first image, the breadstick sat alone on a plate, isolated and inadequate, the blurred shapes of elaborate meals visible in the background. The second showed my face in profile, the exact moment something had shifted inside me, the determination and fury and clarity all visible in the set of my jaw and the light in my eyes. The third was Jordan's own hand reaching for the breadstick, and somehow in the composition you could feel both the humiliation of that moment and the defiance that would follow. A local art critic stood in front of the triptych for nearly 20 minutes, taking notes. When she finally moved on, she sought me out among the crowd. "Your son has an extraordinary gift for capturing the weight of small moments," she said. "These photographs feel like the beginning of something that changed everything." "They were," I said simply. Marcus arrived with his husband, both of them dressed in sharp suits that made them look like they'd stepped out of a legal drama. Marcus had become more than just our lawyer over the past 2 years. He'd become a friend, someone who checked in regularly and celebrated our wins and commiserated over the losses. The gallery filled steadily as the evening progressed. Art students from the university, local photographers, people who'd followed Jordan's work on social media. The exhibition ran for 6 weeks and received coverage in local papers and art blogs. Jordan was interviewed multiple times, always thoughtful and articulate, always crediting the people who'd supported him. Me and Nicole and his grandfather and the community that had shown up when it mattered. Universities started reaching out about scholarship opportunities. A gallery in Santa Fe wanted to feature his work in a group show. My son's talent was opening doors I'd never been able to open for him, and watching it happen felt like validation of every hard choice I'd made. One Saturday afternoon near the end of the exhibition's run, Jordan and I sat on our balcony, watching the sunset paint the Austin skyline in shades of orange and purple. "You know what's weird?" he said, his camera resting in his lap. "What?" "I used to think that dinner ruined everything. But actually it fixed everything. Just had to break first." I looked at my son, wise beyond his years, and nodded. Sometimes the only way through is to stop pretending things aren't broken. He smiled and raised his camera, capturing the moment, documenting our truth the way he always did. That evening, Jordan handed me his laptop. "I made something for you." On the screen was a digital photo album he'd compiled. Pictures of our life over the past 2 years. The new apartment. Saturday morning farmers markets. Nicole bringing takeout after long days. My father teaching Jordan to fish during his visit. Me laughing at something ridiculous, caught in a moment of pure joy. And at the end, a photo I recognized from the exhibition, but with new text overlaid. "Family isn't what you're born into. It's what you build. It's who shows up. It's love that respects and celebrates you exactly as you are. That's the inheritance that matters. The one we choose to pass down." We ordered pizza that night and ate it on the balcony under string lights Jordan had hung last month. The city spread out below us, alive with possibility, and the million small stories of people building lives that mattered. The breadstick that started everything was long forgotten, replaced by a table where everyone was welcome, and no one had to earn their place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.